During a medieval autumn, everyone knew that a challenging winter season was only months away. In medieval times, your social rank in society determined what food you could eat. Danger still lurked around every corner, though at least the threat of famine and starvation was much less for noble families. Compared to the peasant and working classes, there were a relatively small number of rich households. For these noble and wealthy families, autumn was a crucial time of year to prepare for holding feasts, daily meals, and the upcoming winter season. This is why food preparation and storing enough provisions for winter was never far from a noble household's minds. If food did not last until early spring, wealthy families could endure severe hardship, just like the peasant classes. Autumn was traditionally associated with the harvest season, a period which started in early August and lasted until mid-November. Autumn food. Autumn food harvests were preserved to eat during the fall and winter seasons. Grains and cereals harvested from estate lands would be dried and sorted, then stored in clay or ceramic pots for pottages, stews, and making bread. Late season crops provided additional bounty in the latter days of harvest time. Fruit would be dried or sealed in honey to preserve for fall and winter consumption. Unlike peasant meals, experienced cooks prepared all of the food, with wealthy medieval households usually having more than one. Bread was a key staple in medieval noble households and served with every autumn meal. Wealthy medieval families would eat fresh baked loaves made daily with enriched white wheat flour. Hard and soft cheeses made at the estate's dairy would be served with fresh bread. When it came to meat for the autumn season, noble households ate domesticated animals raised on their large estates such as pork, mutton, beef, or chicken. These foods would be spiced and presented in different ways to make unique meals. In addition, wild game caught on their manor grounds were roasted and served with rich sauces. Meats were also put into tarts and pies. Since game like wild-born venison were usually reserved for the nobility, it was considered high-status food. Chases or hunts for noblemen on their large estates were fashionable and helped supply this freshly killed meat. Game birds like ducks, partridge, and pheasants would be roasted and flavored with expensive spices like saffron or ginger. Pâtés were made from various minced game and spiced for flavor. It is important to note that wealthy households also needed to store quantities of meat for the upcoming winter season. Therefore, they would use a number of preservation methods. Smoking meat was a common method for storage. Potted meat was another means for preservation, where cooked meat was shredded and packed into pots. Then, melted fat was added on top to make an airtight layer for later consumption. The container would then be stored in a cold cellar. Jugging involved stewing game in its own juices before sealing the cooked meat in an earthenware jug. The container would be stored in a dark, cold cellar for future consumption. Packing large portions of meat inside barrels between layers of salt was another storage method used by wealthy medieval households. A liquid version of this process placed pieces of meat in a large barrel, which contained a salt brine. Drying large pieces of lightly salted meat in the sun or air was an additional preservation method. Fresh fish caught from rivers and streams on estate lands were either consumed in the autumn or salted and preserved in barrels for wintertime. On the subject of vegetables, wealthy families would harvest cabbages, leeks, peas, parsnips, carrots, and turnips from their estate gardens. These vegetables could be preserved by pickling in brine or vinegar while adding herbs and spices for flavor. Cooked vegetables could be placed in containers of honey or fat, which were then sealed and placed in cold cellars. Root vegetables would be stored in cold cellars, often encased in barrels of sand for preservation. Orchards would provide fruits like apples and pears, which could be preserved by air drying in the sun. These fruits would also be stored in barrels filled with straw to preserve for fall and winter consumption. Another method would preserve fruits in honey or sugar syrups inside tightly sealed containers. Quinces were another fruit used in tarts and preferred for their relatively long storage life. Imported items like almonds and figs were also purchased for fall consumption. Exotic fruits like oranges, dried apricots, and dates were also bought during the fall season, along with candied fruits to serve on special occasions. Similar to peasants, all fruits and vegetables were cooked, since it was believed if eaten raw, they could cause illnesses. Yes, the upper classes of medieval times had a variety of tasty meals to consume, spiced with such flavors as ginger, nutmeg, and pepper, to help ensure they were not the same at every autumn meal. These expensive spices came from trade with countries far from the grounds of these households. Sauces made with spices were preferred by the rich for their extravagant autumn meals. Spices were so important to medieval upper classes that some had special areas devoted to them called a spicery in their kitchen. Generally speaking, many foods they served were heavily spiced. Surprisingly, a dish appreciated by both noble families and peasants alike was pottage. Though for the rich it was called mortrue, a mixture of meats and other ingredients like wine and ground almonds which were cooked together with rich broths. It included expensive spices like cinnamon and often sugar, unlike the peasant version. Frumenti, a kind of thick wheat porridge, was also served, which was often accompanied with venison. Rich medieval families enjoyed banquets during the autumn season. These large feasts were an important part of social life for nobility. It was very important that their food looked stunning and tasted extraordinary. When guests arrived, there were plenty of jellies, pies, custards, and fritters ready to eat on the table. Dinner and dessert were laid out at the same time. Also, desserts were colored to entice the eye with expensive spices like saffron for bright yellows. Tarts would often be sweetened with honey and spices. It is interesting to note that banquets at wealthy households were not only for their noble friends and acquaintances during the fall season. Martinmas on November the 11th traditionally was the day that ended old contractual obligations for workers on a wealthy estate. This coincides with the end of harvest season. To show appreciation for their work, farewell banquets were held for those workers leaving employment at the estate and welcoming banquets for new hires. During autumn, wealthy medieval households would prepare essential medicinal herbs to treat illnesses like pneumonia in the winter season. Gathered from gardens on their estate, herbs, roots, and berries provided protection against pains such as aching joints, coughing, and fevers. Thyme and sage were dried during autumn and used to treat coughing. Elderberries were harvested and boiled when needed to prevent various fevers during autumn and winter. Dried rosemary from the fall harvest was brewed into teas and used as an ingredient in stews and broths for treating colds. Autumn drinks. At noble households, fine drink in the form of domestic or imported wine was consumed with autumn meals. Expensive spices like ginger and cinnamon would often be added to red wine for a distinct flavoring. Mulled wine flavored with spices was also a common autumn drink. In addition, noble families drank large quantities of quality ale and liquor, though alcohol contents were much lower than modern standards. Honey mead would also be offered to guests. Of course, the making of alcohol eliminated potential disease from water sources, making it a popular alternative to drinking water. However, this does not mean noble families did not drink water, provided it was from a safe, clean source on their estates. Fruits such as apples and pears that were not stored became drinks. Pressing machines and fermentation would transform these fruits into quality ciders and beverages. Ales would be brewed from harvested grains, while wassail was a spiced ale served during autumn celebrations in manor homes. Thank you for supporting us at Medieval to Modern. Be sure to watch our next episode or any other fascinating video or playlist from our Medieval to Modern channel. Also, be sure to like, subscribe, comment, click the notification bell, and share this channel so we can create more exciting content. I wish you good tidings, as we remember that sharing knowledge has been a noble deed throughout the ages.